Containers line the streets in Islamabad as ambulances carrying the bodies of 8 members of the same family drive past. Friends of Naveed Iqbal are in shock. They say the police officer and his family were well-liked members of the community.
I still can't believe it, even after I heard about this tragic incident. The whole country is grieving along with the family. Naveed Iqbal was a very nice person. This is a calamitous day.
Temperatures fell to -8 degrees Celsius overnight on Friday in the mountain town of Murree, around 30 kilometres northeast of Islamabad. Thousands of people had travelled to the resort to see the unusually heavy snow, ignoring extreme weather warnings. Some reportedly died of hypothermia after being trapped in their vehicles overnight. Witnesses say others were crushed by falling trees.
Some tourists died in cars, trees fell on the cars and caused their deaths. I'm just back from the area. The army is doing rescue work, but the highway police and the army will have to spend another day completing the rescue work. The traffic jams are bad.
The military has been called in to help rescue thousands of people who are still stranded, but bad weather is making their job difficult. Pakistan's Interior Minister arrived in Murree on Saturday to see the rescue operation for himself. He promised that everyone still stranded would be rescued soon.
All government rest houses have opened on the instructions of the Chief Minister of Punjab. We are starting a helicopter service as soon as the weather clears, but still the weather is bad. If some people are stranded in forests, we will rescue them.
Prime Minister Imran Khan says he is shocked and upset. He's ordered an inquiry and is promising to introduce new regulations to prevent a tragedy like this happening again.
Charred remnants from people's lives peek through a blanket of snow. A winter storm hit Colorado's Boulder County days after fire had engulfed entire neighborhoods. The fires began in northern Denver, and within hours they destroyed 1,000 homes after sweeping through Superior Town and the city of Louisville.
You know, these are quiet little blocks where kids play. They did.
This local resident and his dog were lucky not to lose their home.
Walking through that devastation yesterday was, on one hand, heartbreaking because you know that people lost all their belongings, their memories that were in those homes, families that were raised there.
US President Joe Biden has offered funds to help with the recovery, and the county sheriff says a search is continuing for victims.
The scenes are still hot. They're still, deep in debris, hot debris, covered with snow. So it's a very difficult task.
Scientists say unusual weather had a domino effect. Early torrential rain led to prairie grasses growing high. A dry winter turned the ground to kindling, and powerful winds downed power lines, igniting the grass.
In Indonesia's Aceh province, days of unrelenting rain has forced thousands of people from their homes. At least 15 sub-districts are affected. Many parts of Indonesia experience flooding during the monsoon season, from November to March. But some people here told Al Jazeera they have never seen floods like this.
This time it's really bad. We are taking refuge. Some of us are going to our relatives' houses because the water is up to 2 meters high in our homes.
Local authorities are providing food and other essentials.
We have resources in our warehouses, and so far it's still enough. We're distributing it to the people today and tomorrow.
He says it is difficult to know how many people are impacted by the floods due to communications being affected.
The number of people taking refuge is in the thousands. We do have some issues because many areas are currently experiencing blackouts.
Thousands of homes have been damaged in North Aceh, as well as a school. Many have been evacuated to a nearby prayer space, anxiously waiting for waters to recede. The head of North Aceh's Disaster Mitigation Agency told Al Jazeera the region has flooded several times in recent months, and that deforestation has made the area more vulnerable to severe flooding. As people struggle to cope, more rain is being forecast for later this week.
The snow that once capped the Andes Mountains above Chile's capital and Central Valley is conspicuously absent. For centuries, melting ice nourished rivers below. 400 kilometers to the north, La Paloma, South America's largest irrigation reservoir, has only 20% left of the water that once made this valley flourish. Further north, the deficit is 100%. 13 years of relentless drought, the longest on record, is transforming Chile, and not for the better.
We're standing on the river which we depend on to water our crops, but look at the state it's in. It used to carry loads of water, but it's all dried up. This year it practically didn't rain at all.
Mr. Echeverria and his sole employee are trying to revive the vines that survived last year's dismal harvest.
There's years of work, sacrifice and investment here, and it's sad to see our livelihood and that of so many families lost. I used to have 50 workers here at this time of year, and that source of employment is now gone.
Small farmers and multi-billion-dollar agricultural exporters alike are suffering the consequences.
It's been described as the worst blow to wildlife in Israel's history. This nature reserve in the north was once a birdwatcher's dream. Migratory cranes gather here from colder climates before moving south to Africa. But avian flu has turned it into a graveyard.
The scope of the current outbreak in Israel is massive, and we see that it's not stopping in the wild animals. So it is worrisome, and I must say that with the attention of the Israeli government and other countries to COVID-19, we should not neglect other public health hazards, and we must tackle avian influenza as well.
The cleanup is taking time, the area now off limits to the public for fear of contagion.
At first, about 2 weeks ago, when they discovered the disease, about 50 to 100 dead cranes were identified here. Within a few days, the numbers reached thousands, and today there are about 5,000 to 6,000.
Israel is taking preemptive measures and has culled hundreds of thousands of chickens. The virus hasn't yet been contained. And even though we're told the threat of spreading to humans is low, it remains a possibility that needs to be taken seriously.
We fear of the possibility that the same person will get infected from human influenza and from avian influenza, and there will be genetic reassortment, and we will have a new virus that is both pathogenic and easily spread among humans. That's a theoretical possibility, but we must be very alert in order to prevent it.
At a time when the world is already struggling to contain mutations of COVID-19, with Omicron infections here expected to double and triple over the next few weeks, images like this are only making people more nervous.
Over the next 3 months, the Omicron variant is expected to account for 3 billion infections worldwide. That's as many as during the entire pandemic so far. And yet, there is optimism that this may be the beginning of the end.
I think the vaccines and drugs that are now available can reduce COVID burden by over 95%, so that it's no longer a top 10 health problem. I think it's going to be very difficult to actually get it under control in terms of controlling cases. So we're talking about controlling severe disease and reducing mortality massively. So whilst there still will be cases, unfortunately, they will be much less severe overall.
South Africa, where Omicron was first detected, is now providing intriguing clues about what may happen next. Infection numbers there are dropping fast in a population that's achieved high levels of natural immunity, down more than 50% from their peak. Restrictions are being lifted, and a number of international studies support claims that Omicron is less dangerous, confining itself more to the nasal and upper respiratory passages than the lungs.
The infection numbers are enormous, and yet undeniably the public health consequences are less severe. So have we genuinely reached a turning point? Well, plenty of scientists seem to think so, and even the World Health Organization says that 2022 could bring an end to the acute phase of the pandemic.
But the World Health Organization cautions that's possible only if the vaccines and treatments available in the rich world are made equally available to all, a goal the world is some way from achieving. And even then, scientific views are divided.
The Omicron variant actually shows us that this virus is very flexible. The Omicron variant is so different to the other variants that we've seen that it's actually able to enter in cells in completely different ways from the ways previous variants used to enter. And what we realize is that the space for adaptation of this virus is quite large. And as long as transmission is allowed to continue, the course of the pandemic is going to be very, very unpredictable.
High transmission rates raise other concerns too, the debilitating effects of long COVID, the continued risk to the vulnerable and the unvaccinated. Increasingly, though, policy thinking seems to be shifting away from long-term control measures towards the view that the vast majority of us may be able to live alongside the virus, eventually posing as much risk to public health as the flu.
The southern summer is in full swing on the crowded beaches of Cape Town, where life seems completely normal. Many South Africans think their country is being unnecessarily characterized as a pandemic hotspot.
Compared to other countries, I don't think we're doing as bad as the countries that are blocking us from coming into their countries.
I think it is because we are a developing country. That's why they are putting us on the red list. But if we were like America, then we wouldn't be on a red list.
This developing country discovered the Omicron variant and is still studying it. In this laboratory in Durban, 2/3 of the continent's COVID samples have been analysed. South African scientists who are at the forefront of global COVID research have published several studies with similar conclusions. The Omicron variant causes less severe disease than the other variants.
That this variant can still make people very sick, and it can still cause people to die. But if you have that protection, that immune protection, either from previous infection or from vaccination, then your risk of getting very sick and dying is much, much less.
South African hospitals have never been full with the Omicron variant. Experts believe that South Africans have developed herd immunity during previous waves. With the health system under no pressure, authorities did not want to impose further restrictions. They still encourage people to get vaccinated, and almost 40% of the adult population has done so. It seems that South Africa has surfed over the peak of the fourth wave of COVID-19 infections smoothly, but experts warn the South African case study might not be applicable everywhere else due to unique variables like the young age of the population, the rate of immunity and the climate, seeing as it's summer in the southern hemisphere.
There was an uproar in France's parliament as Emmanuel Macron's comments and strong language about unvaccinated people became public. Some opposition MPs booed the health minister, while others described the French president's words as vulgar, before a debate on the government's proposed vaccine pass was abruptly suspended.
We ask for the presence of the Prime Minister because the words of the President of the Republic are unworthy, irresponsible, contemptuous and above all very premeditated. This is the reality of the situation and we can't accept it.
In the Parisian newspaper, Macron said that unvaccinated people were irresponsible. As for the unvaccinated, I really want to piss them off, he said. We have to tell them, you will no longer be able to go to the restaurant. You will no longer be able to go for coffee. You will no longer be able to go to the theatre. You will no longer be able to go to the cinema. France has recorded record numbers of new COVID infections in recent days, fuelled by the Delta and Omicron variants. Doctors say most COVID patients in intensive care are unvaccinated. The French government says vaccination is the best way out of the pandemic. Although 90% of the population are immunised, the government's targeting those yet to receive a jab. 3 months before the French presidential election, Macron risks alienating some voters, but his supporters say he's taking a calculated risk, betting on the majority of French people agreeing with him because they're fed up of restrictions and want to see an end to the COVID crisis.
Traditionally, French voters don't like aggressiveness in electoral campaigns, above all from a sitting president.
So Macron took a risk. But it was an assumed risk because this interview was reread and approved by the Elysée. It wasn't a gaffe or an error of communication. It was intentional. He's sending a message that the campaign will happen with a certain rhythm and tone.
Macron has yet to declare his candidacy for the presidential race, but he is widely expected to run. His victory in 2017 was partly due to the image he projected as a straight talker who didn't shy away from controversy and was unafraid to break with tradition. But whether it will be a winning formula this time around is uncertain.
These are the people that Emmanuel Macron, in his words, wants to piss off. And it looks like he's succeeded. Over 100,000 people across France protested on Saturday over government plans to further pressure the country's unvaccinated population. The proposed law would allow only those who are fully vaccinated to eat out, travel on intercity trains, or attend public events. There are around 18,000 demonstrators in Paris, many of them unmasked.
Notre président est en train de monter les personnes vaccinées contre les personnes non vaccinées. Et ça, c'est pas digne d'un président de la République. Les propos qu'il a tenus récemment sont totalement choquants.
Donc c'est nos libertés. Macron ne respecte pas la Constitution, donc c'est très grave pour moi. Il m'a insulté au niveau comment dire, citoyenneté.
Demonstrations were held across the country, like here in Toulon, where 6,000 people took to the streets. Despite the high turnout, these protesters are a vocal minority. Only around 10% of adults have yet to get the jab. But official figures show the unvaccinated are at least 9 times more likely to end up in intensive care if they catch COVID, putting pressure on hospitals and prompting Paris to act. The government hopes to have the new requirements in force by mid-January.
Liberté! 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 Liberté!
This wasn't the arrival the world's #1 men's tennis player had planned on the eve of the Australian Open. Whisked off to a government quarantine hotel with his visa revoked on touchdown. Immigration authorities said Novak Djokovic had failed to meet the requirements to enter.
There are no special cases. Rules are rules. That's the policy of the government and has been our government's strong border protection policies, and particularly in relation to the pandemic, that has ensured that Australia has one of the lowest death rates from COVID anywhere in the world.
Tennis Australia and the Victorian government had granted him a medical exemption to travel to Melbourne to defend his Grand Slam title. But the federal government deemed his application insufficient, with reports the visa he used to try and enter Australia did not allow for exemptions for unvaccinated travellers.
The ABF has done their job. Entry with a visa requires double vaccination or a medical exemption. I'm advised that such an exemption was not in place, and as a result, he is subject to the same rule as anyone else.
Djokovic has never publicly revealed his vaccination status, but his opposition to vaccinate is well known. His medical exemption to travel to Australia triggered widespread anger from many who've endured months of lockdowns, and as COVID-19 infections reach record daily numbers. But his supporters are furious, with the Serbian president labelling the incident harassment and maltreatment, declaring on social media that his country will fight for Novak, truth and justice.
He's got a massive Serbian community behind him and we all love him and can't wait to actually come and support him and actually see him play.
Thank you Australia for locking him down like a refugee, like a criminal. Thank you so much.
Novak Djokovic had been seeking to win his 21st Grand Slam singles title overtaking Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer at this tournament. For now, those hopes seem dashed. Instead, he's facing a legal battle to try and stop being sent home.
Outside the Serbian parliament in Belgrade, protesters chant in support of their national hero, the world's #1 in men's tennis, Novak Djokovic. The demonstration is led by his father, who says Australia is playing politics with his son's career.
They want to throw him on his knees. This won't happen. They never managed to throw Serbia on its knees. We never attacked anyone. We only defended ourselves. And Novak is defending himself now, brothers and sisters. Our heart, our soul, our pride.
This is the moment when Djokovic is about to realise his entry into Australia is blocked, his visa revoked. It isn't a tennis court he's going to. Instead, he's waiting for a court hearing on Monday that will rule on his deportation. For now, he's in a government quarantine hotel. His mother is outraged.
They are keeping him as a prisoner. It's just not fair, it's not human. So I just hope that he will be strong, as we are trying also to be very strong.
Djokovic had a medical exemption to let him play at the Australian Open tournament later this month. Otherwise, the tournament is only open to the fully vaccinated. The exemption caused a wave of anger among Australians who still face some of the toughest travel restrictions in the world. Djokovic is well known as being against vaccinations. Another big name in the sport believes Djokovic has himself to blame.
In some way, I feel sorry for him, but at the same time, he knew the conditions since a lot of months ago. So
the action against Djokovic is also causing a diplomatic incident. Serbia's president describes it as politically motivated.
It's our obligation as a state to protect the interests of our citizens. We're dedicated to that. What's not fair is that this is a political persecution that everyone is taking part in, even the Australian Prime Minister.
Djokovic had thought the path was clear for his attempt at a 21st Grand Slam. Instead, he faces what could be a roadblock, and with it a worldwide debate on whether he's been fairly treated.
A maskless Novak Djokovic, pictured at events the day after his lawyers say he tested positive for COVID-19. The world #1 was seen hugging children at a tennis centre in his native Serbia and spoke at an event for his foundation. His lawyers say the positive result on December 16th means the tennis powerhouse had a medical exemption to enter Australia to play in the Open later this month.
He thought, along with the guidance from Tennis Australia, who told players that if they weren't vaccinated, one of the ways they could get around entry into Australia was if they had tested positive to COVID in the past 6 months, then they were exempt from getting vaccinated and could enter the country without quarantine.
But on Wednesday, Australian border officials told Djokovic it wasn't enough for an exemption. He was stopped at the border, his visa cancelled, and is now in immigration detention in Melbourne ahead of a hearing on Monday.
Let him go! He's not a criminal!
Protesters have gathered outside the hotel, pledging their support for the 34-year-old athlete.
The longer it goes on, it's more and more embarrassing for Australia, which is supposed to be the home of the free, and we're not. He's locked up in that hotel room.
Djokovic has never revealed his vaccination status and has been a vocal opponent of vaccine mandates. The visa controversies led to a sporting and diplomatic dispute, with Serbia accusing Australia of treating Djokovic like a prisoner.
He had all the assurances that his visa paperwork was in order and confidently announced his departure for Melbourne. During his 24-hour flight, things took a dramatic turn, and it appears that his arrival became a political hot potato between the Victorian state government and the federal government, who both wanted to rid themselves of responsibility for his visa.
Djokovic isn't the only athlete who's been caught up. Czech player Renata Vorokova was detained in the same hotel. She left the country after her visa was also revoked, following issues with her medical exemption. Djokovic had travelled to Australia seeking to win his record-breaking 21st Grand Slam singles title. He's asked for alternative accommodation so he can still train for the event. That request has been denied.
As calm returns to the streets of Kazakhstan's main city, Almaty residents struggle to buy food and fuel, some of them queuing outside this bakery on Saturday.
Другие крупные сетевые магазины, вот, допустим, чуть выше от нас находится Магна, чуть дальше Смол. Они закрыты. Сегодня, вчера, соответственно, людям что-то же кушать надо.
This petrol station can be seen crowded with cars. Locals say the lack of fuel has led to a price hike for things like flour and potatoes.
Потому что, знаете, вопрос один, что сейчас немножко сложно с поставками. Люди сетуют на то, что нет топлива. Продукты питания есть на складах где-то, но из-за того, что сейчас говорят, выставлены блокпосты, плюс отсутствие ГСМ, они просто не могут привезти.
The protests initially began in response to an increase in fuel prices, but there's also anger over the lingering influence of former President Nursultan Nazarbayev. It marks Kazakhstan's worst unrest in 30 years. Officials say security forces killed more than 24 demonstrators, while at least 18 members of law enforcement died. More than 5,000 people have been arrested. Though streets were calmer on Saturday, the security situation remains tense. Russian troops and their allies continue to pour into Kazakhstan. The president's office said the soldiers were guarding a number of strategic facilities.
Calm has returned to the centre of Almaty, though the signs of violence are everywhere. On Republic Square, scene of the worst of the clashes, security forces have retaken control of gutted government buildings. But there have been food shortages and queues at cash machines and petrol stations, with residents venturing out only for essentials.
At night, when we hear explosions, I'm scared. It pains me to know that young people are dying.
We are scared not just for ourselves, but for our children and other people's children. We never expected such things could happen, especially in Almaty.
Gunfire could still be heard on Friday as military units raced through Almaty's streets. In the eastern city of Taldykorgan, where a statue of the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was pulled down, the euphoria has now evaporated. A police loudspeaker warns people to stay indoors while an anti-terror operation gets underway. President Kasim Jomart Tokayev has shown little sympathy for the protesters or calls for calm.
There have been calls abroad for the parties to move the negotiations to a peaceful resolution. What nonsense! What kind of negotiations can there be with criminals, with murderers? We had to deal with armed and trained bandits, both local and foreign.
The claim, without evidence, that protesters are foreign-backed terrorists was the pretext to invite the Moscow-led security bloc to send in its forces. 3,600 CSTO soldiers, most of them Russian peacekeepers, are being deployed. Democracy activists have expressed dismay that their calls for change have gone unheard. The banner reads, "We are citizens, not terrorists." Peaceful demonstrations are still taking place. This is Zhanaozen in the west of Kazakhstan. But legitimate protests now risk being stamped out by a shoot-to-kill policy. Robin Forestier Walker,